Hi, welcome to the Silent Avenger channel. If you're enjoying the content, please consider giving it a like and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Let's dive into today's story. I'm Andre, 38 now, but this story really starts about 15 years ago. I came from nothing, small town, parents who worked hard but didn't have much. Growing up, I learned early that if I wanted anything, I had to hustle for it. So when I graduated high school, I didn't have big dreams like some of my friends who went off to college. I just wanted to work, save up, and eventually start my own business. At 23, I was working at this rundown warehouse as a forklift operator, making just enough to pay bills. The job sucked, but I saw potential in the industry. Warehousing was growing fast, and I figured, why work for someone else when I could build my own thing? That's how the dream started. I met Willa a couple of years later. She was everything I wasn't: polished, charming, and with this way of lighting up a room. She worked as an administrative assistant at a logistics firm. We clicked fast. She believed in me when nobody else did. I told her about my plan to save up and one day run my own warehouse, and she said something I'll never forget: "You'll make it, Andre. I know you will." It took years of overtime shifts and living off ramen to save up enough to buy a small space. Willa was there the whole time, pushing me when I wanted to quit. I started with 1 truck and 3 employees, working day and night to get things off the ground. Slowly but surely, the business grew. By the time I hit my early 30s, I had a real operation going. I was proud of what I'd built, but the success came with sacrifices. That's where things with Willa started to shift. At first, she loved the grind as much as I did, but as the late nights and missed weekends piled up, the cracks began to show. She'd say stuff like, "Do you even remember the last time we had dinner together?" Or, "You're married to that warehouse, not me." I'd promised to make it up to her, but something always came up: contracts, deadlines, hiring, expansion plans. Looking back, I should have seen it coming. But at the time I thought, I'm doing this for us. She'll understand. Things got worse between me and Willa after a few years of running the warehouse. By then it wasn't just one location anymore. I had 3 warehouses, dozens of employees, and contracts with some big-name companies. My dream was coming true, but at what cost? Willa had always been my rock, but now it felt like we were on different planets. I'd come home late, exhausted, and she'd barely look up from her phone. I'd try to tell her about a big client I landed, and she'd just nod saying, "That's nice, Andre," like she couldn't care less. I thought maybe a vacation would help. So, I surprised her with a trip to Mexico for our anniversary. She smiled, hugged me, and said it was sweet, but when we got there, she spent more time on Instagram than with me. The whole trip felt forced. Every dinner turned into her complaining about how I didn't listen or how I didn't make time for her. I didn't know how to respond. I wanted to say, "I'm doing all this for you, for us," but deep down, I knew I hadn't been there for her like I used to. Around this time, I started noticing little changes. Willa was dressing nicer than usual, even just to go to work. She started going out more with her coworkers, saying it was for networking or team bonding. I didn't think much of it at first. I trusted her, and honestly, I was too wrapped up in my business to really notice how distant she'd become. One night, she came home late after one of these work outings. She was laughing at something on her phone, and when I asked her what was so funny, she just said, "Oh, it's nothing." Dale sent a meme in the group chat. Dale. I'd heard his name before, her boss. I'd never met him, but from what she told me, he seemed like a typical corporate guy. Smooth talker, always cracking jokes. I didn't think much of it at first, but then she started mentioning him more and more. "Dale said this today," or "Dale thinks I'd be great for this project." I'll admit, I started feeling uneasy, but I brushed it off. Willa wasn't the type to cheat, or so I thought. Then came the night that changed everything. It was a Friday night. I had just finished a long day at the warehouse, negotiating with a supplier who kept messing up deliveries. All I wanted was to go home, eat something, and pass out. When I walked in, the house was quiet, too quiet. Willa wasn't home, which wasn't unusual these days. She'd been working late a lot recently. I made myself a sandwich, sat down on the couch, and flipped on the TV. A couple of hours passed, and I realized she still wasn't back. I texted her, "Hey, you okay? When are you coming home?" No response. By 11 p.m., I was annoyed. I called her, and it went straight to voicemail. That's when I felt the first real pang of worry. Something didn't feel right. I sat there staring at my phone, debating whether I was overreacting or if I should try calling again. Finally, around midnight, she walked in. She smelled like wine and perfume, not hers. Her makeup was smudged, and her hair looked like she'd been in a wind tunnel. "Where have you been?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. She froze, like a deer caught in headlights. "I told you I had a work dinner," she said, her tone defensive. "At midnight." I pressed. She rolled her eyes and brushed past me. "It ran late, Audrey. I don't have to report my every move to you." Her attitude threw me off. Willa was usually quick to explain herself, but now she was acting like I was the problem for asking. I followed her into the bedroom. "You could have at least texted me back." I was worried. "I didn't see your messages," she snapped, pulling off her heels. "Can we not do this right now? I'm tired." I wanted to believe her, I really did. But something in her voice, in the way she avoided eye contact, screamed that she wasn't telling me the whole truth. The next morning, I woke up to find her already gone. She left a note on the kitchen counter, "Went to brunch with the girls. Don't wait up." Except when I checked her Instagram later, there was nothing about brunch, no group selfies, no mimosa pics. Just radio silence. That's when the doubts started creeping in. And once they started, they didn't stop. I tried to shake the doubts for a while. I told myself I was being paranoid, that Willa wouldn't do something like that to me. But the signs kept piling up. She started working late more often, always with vague explanations. Her phone was suddenly glued to her hand, and she kept it face down whenever we were together. When she wasn't home, I'd catch myself pacing the house, replaying conversations in my head, trying to figure out if I was imagining things or if something was really off. One night, she left her laptop open on the kitchen table. I wasn't looking for anything, I swear I wasn't. But as I walked by, I noticed an email notification pop up. It was from Dale. I don't know what came over me, but I clicked on it. It wasn't some innocent work email. It was personal, too personal. He was thanking her for last night, and how he couldn't stop thinking about her. My stomach dropped. I scrolled up and saw a whole string of messages, going back weeks. Flirty banter, inside jokes, even photos of them together at a bar. My hands were shaking as I read through them. There was no mistaking it, this wasn't just some harmless friendship. Willa was cheating on me with her boss. I don't remember much about that moment. My mind went blank. All I know is that I slammed the laptop shut and sat there, staring at the table like it would give me answers. When Willa came home that night, I couldn't even look at her. She walked in, all smiles, and asked, "What's for dinner?" like everything was fine. I forced myself to stay calm, to not let her see what I knew. "Leftovers in the fridge," I said, my voice colder than I intended. She hesitated, looking at me like she could sense something was wrong. "You okay?" I nodded, but inside, I was anything but okay. After that night, I couldn't unsee the emails. It was like they were burned into my brain. Every time Willa smiled at me or kissed me goodbye, I'd hear Dale's name in the back of my head. I wanted to confront her so badly, but something stopped me. I wasn't ready, not yet. I needed more proof, something undeniable. So, I did what I never thought I'd do. I started digging. When Willa was in the shower, I checked her phone. It was locked, but she used the same passcode for years. I told myself it wasn't snooping, it was finding the truth. And what I found confirmed everything. There were texts between her and Dale. Not just casual texts either. He was calling her babe, telling her he missed her, asking when they'd see each other again. She wasn't exactly shutting him down either. She sent pictures, selfies from work, a mirror shot in a dress I didn't even know she owned. But the worst part was a string of texts from a week ago. "Dale, you looked incredible last night." "Willa, you're sweet." I needed that. Dale, same time next week? "Willa, can't wait." I don't know what hurt more, the words or the fact that she was so casual about it, like I didn't even exist. That night, as we lay in bed, I stared at the ceiling while Willa scrolled through her phone next to me. My chest felt like it was caving in. I wanted to scream, to shake her and ask why she was doing this, but I stayed quiet. I started watching her more closely after that. She'd leave for work dinners, and I'd track her location through the Find My iPhone app. It wasn't work. She was going to the same hotel downtown every time. One night, when she said she'd be late, I followed her. I parked a block away and watched as she walked into that hotel, dressed like she was going on a date. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. I waited for an hour, maybe two, hoping she'd come out. But she didn't. I drove home that night feeling like a ghost. Willa came back hours later, slipping into bed like nothing happened. That's when I knew I couldn't let this go. She wasn't just lying, she was living a double life. And I wasn't going to let her get away with it. The following morning, Willa acted like everything was normal, like she hadn't just spent the night with another man. She hummed while making coffee, asked me if I needed her to pick up anything from the store, and even kissed me on the cheek before heading out to work. It was sickening. But instead of blowing up, I stayed calm. If anything, I played along. "Thanks, babe. Love you," I said as she walked out the door. It was the hardest thing I'd ever done, but I knew I couldn't let my emotions take over, not yet. I needed a plan. That day, I sat in my office at the warehouse, staring at the wall, trying to figure out what to do. I could confront her, sure. I could yell, demand answers, threaten divorce. But where would that leave me? A messy breakup, more lies, and probably nothing to show for it. No, I wanted more than that. I wanted her to feel what I felt, betrayed, humiliated, and completely blindsided. That's when the idea hit me. What if I could flip the script? What if I could take their betrayal and use it against them? I started jotting down ideas, and before I knew it, I had the outline of a plan. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. First, I needed evidence. Not just texts or emails, real, undeniable proof. Something that would destroy Willa and Dale's reputations. I hired a private investigator, a guy named Sam who came highly recommended by a buddy of mine. Sam didn't ask a lot of questions, which I appreciated. I gave him Willa's schedule, the hotel details, and Dale's name. Within a week, he had photos, Willa and Dale together at the hotel, laughing, holding hands, and eventually kissing in the parking lot. Seeing those pictures was like a knife to the gut, but it was exactly what I needed to stay focused. Next, I started putting the other pieces of the plan in place. I spent late nights going through our finances, making sure I had control over everything: bank accounts, investments, even the house. I didn't want Willa to walk away with a dime more than she deserved. Then came the hardest part: planting the seeds for my disappearance. The idea of staging my own disappearance came to me late one night, lying awake in bed while Willa slept next to me. She looked so peaceful, like she didn't have a care in the world, and that made me hate her even more. How could she sleep so easily after everything she'd done? If I wanted this plan to work, I couldn't just vanish out of the blue. It had to be believable, like something had happened to me. I started small, making subtle changes to my behavior. I'd leave earlier in the mornings and come home later at night, pretending to be swamped with work. When Willa asked what was going on, I'd say things like, "It's just stress. The warehouses are killing me," or, "I'm trying to land a new client. It's taking everything I've got." At first, she didn't seem to care much. She'd shrug and go back to scrolling through her phone. But as the days went on, I noticed she started paying more attention. Maybe it was guilt, or maybe she was just trying to keep up appearances, but she'd occasionally ask if I was okay. "I'm fine," I'd say, brushing her off. "Just tired." At the same time, I started dropping hints to friends and employees. Little things, like mentioning how overwhelmed I felt or joking about running away and living on a beach somewhere. I wasn't sure if anyone would take me seriously, but that wasn't the point. I just needed the groundwork laid. The next step was planting evidence. I started by creating fake documents, emails, letters, and even a notebook where I journaled about how stressed and unhappy I was. I wrote things like, "I don't know how much more I can take," and "I feel like I'm drowning, and no one even notices." I left the notebook out in the open, knowing Willa would see it eventually. Then I started acting distracted around her, pretending to forget things or staring off into space during conversations. She started noticing, asking, "What's wrong with you?" or "Are you sure you're okay?" I knew I had to take it up a notch. One night, while she was in the shower, I called a close friend and pretended to have a meltdown. "I don't know what to do anymore," I said, making sure my voice sounded shaky. "Everything's falling apart." The friend tried to comfort me, but I ended the call quickly, saying, I just needed to get that off my chest. I made sure to drop Willa's name too, saying, She doesn't get it. She doesn't care. The next morning, I left a few of my things in disarray, my wallet on the counter, my keys left on the couch, and my work laptop open with an email draft about feeling trapped. I wanted her to start noticing, to feel like something was off. Then came the hardest part, leaving her a trail that would tie everything back to Dale. By this point, I'd built a careful web of breadcrumbs that would make people believe I'd snapped under the pressure of my business and personal life. But I didn't want this to just look like a disappearance. I wanted it to point squarely at Willa and Dale. The first step was linking Willa and Dale in a way they couldn't deny. I went through the photos and texts the private investigator had gathered and made copies, careful not to leave any trace that could be tied back to me. I slipped them into a cheap envelope, along with a short, handwritten note. Whoever finds this, know they're responsible for what happened to me. I didn't sign it, but I included dates and locations from their messages, just enough to make it clear the note came from me. Then, I started laying groundwork for my departure. I withdrew small amounts of cash over a couple of weeks, just enough to make it look like I'd been planning something without setting off alarms. I rented a storage unit under a fake name and filled it with basic supplies, clothes, toiletries, and enough canned food to last me a few weeks. I also bought a cheap burner phone, cash only, and used it to send myself a series of cryptic text messages. Things like, "You sure you want to go through with this? We both know they deserve it. Just remember to cover your tracks." I deleted the messages after reading them but left the phone where it would be found, another piece of evidence to make it look like I was spiraling. The final piece of the puzzle was setting the stage. One Friday, I told Willa I had a late meeting and wouldn't be home for dinner. Instead, I drove to an old hiking trail on the outskirts of town, a place I used to visit years ago when I needed to clear my head. I parked my truck in the lot, left my wallet and phone on the dashboard, and walked about a mile into the woods. There I staged a small scene, a torn piece of my shirt snagged on a branch, a few drops of animal blood I'd bought from a butcher, and scuff marks on the ground to make it look like there'd been a struggle. Satisfied with my work, I walked back to the main road, where I'd arranged for a private driver, another cash-only transaction, to pick me up. I left town that night and checked into a motel 2 states away, using an alias I'd prepared weeks in advance. The next morning, I knew the storm was about to hit. The morning after I staged my disappearance, I could barely sleep. I lay on the lumpy motel bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the fallout to begin. It didn't take long. Around 8 a.m., my phone buzzed, well, the burner phone I'd brought with me. I'd left my real phone behind in the truck as part of the scene, but the burner let me monitor everything quietly from a distance. My best friend, Greg, called first. Then another call, this time from one of my warehouse managers. "Hey man, just checking in. Where are you?" Greg said in his voicemail, his tone uneasy. The messages kept coming. By mid-morning, the police had been called. They found my truck, the wallet, and the bloody scene in the woods. From what I pieced together later, the story blew up fast. Local business owner missing under mysterious circumstances was splashed across the news by that evening. And Willa? She played her part perfectly, though not by choice. She called me once, then twice, then several times. I didn't pick up. Her voicemail started out worried. "Andre, where are you? You're scaring me." But by the third or fourth message, there was something else in her voice, panic. Later that day, I checked the local news online. They interviewed Willa outside our house, her face pale and eyes red from crying. "He's been under so much stress lately," she said, her voice trembling. "I just want him to come home." It was almost convincing. Almost. But the real fun started when the police started digging. By Monday, they had my journal, the burner phone I'd planted, and the staged emails on my laptop. Everything painted the picture I wanted them to see, a man who felt betrayed and broken, and who'd finally snapped. But here's the thing about evidence, it's only as good as the people it points to. A few days later, they found the envelope I'd left behind, the one with the photos and texts of Willa and Dale. It was enough to make them start asking questions. Willa, of course, denied everything at first. She probably thought she could talk her way out of it, the way she always did when she got caught in a lie. But Dale? He crumbled like wet paper. I'd timed everything perfectly. On the day I disappeared, Dale had been in a meeting all morning, but the emails and texts suggested otherwise. He couldn't account for his whereabouts the night before, and when the investigators started digging into his and Willa's phones, they found more than enough to tie them together. Willa must have realized the walls were closing in because her texts to me took a desperate turn. "Andre, please. If you're out there, just come home. We can fix this. I love you." I didn't answer. Instead, I watched from my motel room as the story unraveled. The news painted Willa and Dale as prime suspects in my disappearance. Neighbors started whispering. Friends began pulling away. Dale's company suspended him, pending investigation, and Willa's coworkers started looking at her like she was poison. It was everything I wanted. The days after my disappearance were a whirlwind of chaos, for them, at least. For me, sitting in that cramped motel room 2 states away, it was oddly quiet. I had nothing but time to watch the fallout unfold, checking updates online and listening to the local news. Every day brought a new development, and every one of them hit Willa and Dale harder than the last. The police started treating my case as foul play after reviewing the evidence. The journal, the photos, the staged scene in the woods, it all painted a clear picture. I'd been struggling, possibly pushed to the edge, and the people closest to me had a motive. Willa must have thought she could handle it. I mean, she'd been lying to me for months, right? What were a few more lies to the cops? But the thing about liars is they start to trip up when the stakes get high. The first crack in her story came when she told the police she didn't know why I'd been stressed. "Everything seemed fine between us," she said in one of her interviews. But then the texts between her and Dale surfaced, the ones where they were planning meetups and trading pet names. The ones where they laughed about how clueless I supposedly was. When confronted, she panicked. "Those are taken out of context," she tried to explain. "Dale and I are just close friends." The cops weren't buying it. And Dale? He was even worse under pressure. The moment the investigators showed him the texts and photos, he folded. "It wasn't what it looked like," he stammered, but the evidence said otherwise. He tried to distance himself from Willa, claiming she'd been the one pursuing him, but his weak denials only made him look guiltier. What made it even better was the court of public opinion. By now, my story had made headlines statewide. People were glued to the updates, speculating about what really happened to me. And let me tell you, the internet isn't kind to people like Willa and Dale. Social media exploded with outrage. People dug into Dale's background, finding old complaints about his inappropriate behavior at work. Willa wasn't spared either. Neighbors and even some of her coworkers started posting about how fake she'd always seemed, how they'd always suspected something was off about her. It didn't take long for the consequences to hit them where it hurt most. Dale was suspended indefinitely from his job. Even if the investigation cleared him, his reputation was in the gutter. His company didn't want anything to do with him. He was effectively blacklisted in the industry, and no one wanted to be associated with the guy at the center of a missing person turned scandal case. Willa, meanwhile, faced a different kind of fallout. Friends she'd known for years stopped returning her calls. Some even blocked her entirely. Her parents, who had always been polite to me but distant, reportedly refused to take her side. She was drowning, and I wasn't about to throw her a life preserver. The part that really got to me, though, was how fast she tried to spin the narrative. I heard through mutual friends that she'd started telling people I'd been emotionally unstable for years, that my business had been failing, and that she'd stayed with me out of pity. Classic Willa, I thought. Always rewriting the story to make herself the victim. But the beauty of it all was that the evidence I left behind was ironclad. It didn't matter what she said, between the texts, the photos, and the carefully planted suicide notes. It all painted a picture of betrayal and guilt that she couldn't escape. I spent hours imagining the look on her face when the investigators started connecting the dots, when she realized there was no way out. Dale was no knight in shining armor, either. From what I heard, he started distancing himself from her almost immediately, blaming her for the situation. They deserved each other, but the best part? They wouldn't get to keep each other for long. By now, Willa and Dale's lives were unraveling faster than I could have hoped. Watching it all play out from my motel room felt surreal, like I was orchestrating a play, and they were just following the script I'd written. But I wasn't done yet. The police had them both under a microscope, and the media wasn't letting up. Every day, new headlines speculated about what happened to me, hinting at Willa and Dale's involvement. It wasn't just gossip anymore. People genuinely believed they'd had a hand in my disappearance. I decided it was time to tighten the noose. First, I sent an anonymous tip to the police hotline, using the burner phone. I disguised my voice, keeping it low and shaky. "You need to look deeper into Willa and Dale," I said. "They were having an affair, and Andre found out. He confronted them about it. I paused, letting the officer on the other end digest my words before delivering the kicker. I think they did something to him to keep him quiet. I didn't wait for a response. I hung up and tossed the phone into a river on my way back to the motel. It was risky, but I knew it would push the investigation forward, and it worked. The next day, the police executed a search warrant on Dale's apartment and Willa's car. They didn't find anything, of course, but that didn't matter. The news covered it like wildfire, painting Willa and Dale as prime suspects. The pressure started to show. I heard from a mutual friend that Willa had stopped going to work. She's not herself, they said, as if that excused anything. She spent her days holed up at home, avoiding calls and ignoring the reporters who camped outside our house. Dale, meanwhile, was falling apart in his own way. His suspension from work became permanent, and rumors swirled that his wife, oh yeah, did I mention he was married? Had kicked him out. As much as I despised Willa, part of me was almost impressed at how quickly she tried to shift the blame. According to my sources, she told the police that Dale was obsessed with her and that he'd been the one pressuring her into the affair. He manipulated me, she allegedly said during questioning. I didn't want to hurt Andre, but Dale, he wouldn't let me go. It was laughable. I knew Willa better than that. She wasn't anyone's puppet. If anything, she thrived on control. But her attempts to save herself only made her look guiltier. The media ran with her story, dissecting every word she said. Some people bought it, but most didn't. Comments on social media called her a liar, a homewrecker, and worse. Dale, for his part, didn't even bother defending her. He lawyered up and kept quiet, letting her flounder in the spotlight. And me? I kept watching from the sidelines, biding my time. The next phase of my plan was already in motion. I'd been reaching out to a few trusted business contacts, people who didn't know Willa personally but had heard of her through me. I casually mentioned how I'd been worried about her behavior lately, how she'd been distant and secretive. It's been tough, I'd say, letting my voice crack just enough to sell it. I love her, but I don't know if I can trust her anymore. By the time I was gone, those conversations had planted enough doubt to make people question Willa's character. Even people who wanted to believe her innocence couldn't ignore the pattern. I wasn't just ruining her reputation, I was erasing any credibility she had left. Weeks passed, and the chaos surrounding my disappearance didn't let up. Willa and Dale were barely holding it together. News crews swarmed our neighborhood. Friends and co-workers whispered behind their backs, and the cops weren't giving them a moment's peace. For Willa, every day must have felt like a lifetime. Mutual friends told me she'd stopped going outside altogether. Grocery deliveries were left at the door, blinds stayed drawn, and her phone barely rang. From what I gathered, her own parents didn't even visit anymore. Dale was no better off. His wife had filed for divorce, and he was crashing at a friend's place, though not for long. His friend apparently couldn't take the media circus that followed him around and eventually kicked him out. I thought about letting things play out a little longer, but I was growing restless. I'd been holed up in the motel for too long, living off microwave dinners and watching my plan unfold through the screen of a laptop. It was time for the next move. But I wanted it to hit hard. I started by sending an anonymous letter to Willa. It was simple, just 2 sentences. You know what you did. I'm not done yet. I could only imagine her face when she opened it, her hands shaking as she read the words. That wasn't just paranoia, it was a promise. Next, I made sure Dale got the same letter, delivered to the office where he used to work. I wanted to remind him that he wasn't off the hook. The cops got a letter too, though theirs was a little different. In it, I claimed to be a witness who'd seen Willa and Dale arguing with me the night I disappeared. I described how Willa had shouted, "You're ruining everything," and how Dale had grabbed me by the collar, telling me to back off. It was all fabricated, of course, but it fit perfectly with the narrative I'd built. I even included a new lead about a hiking trail near the woods where my truck was found, ensuring the investigators would focus their attention on Willa and Dale. The letters worked better than I could have hoped. The next morning, I watched from the motel as the news reported on a new search in the woods. The footage showed search teams combing the area with dogs, helicopters circling overhead. The reporters speculated that the case had taken a disturbing turn, hinting that foul play was now the primary theory. That same evening, Willa's name was trending on social media again. A neighbor had leaked a photo of her leaving the house in sunglasses and a baseball cap, trying to avoid the press. The caption read, running from the truth, Willa. Dale, meanwhile, stayed out of sight entirely. The media couldn't even get a photo of him, but that only made the public more suspicious. And then came the moment I'd been waiting for. I opened my laptop to check the news, and there it was. Breaking: Willa under official investigation in husband's disappearance. It felt like a victory, but also like closure. Everything I'd planned, every calculated move, had led to this. Willa and Dale weren't just suspects anymore, they were the prime suspects. For once, they didn't look so smug. The headline hit like a bomb: Willa and Dale named prime suspects in Andre's disappearance. I must have read it a dozen times, savoring every word. There they were, their names plastered on every news outlet, tied together not just by their affair but now by a crime they didn't commit. The police, armed with my planted evidence and anonymous tips, were relentless. They called Willa and Dale in for questioning separately, squeezing them for answers. Willa, I learned, broke down almost immediately. Mutual friends told me she showed up to the station with messy hair, no makeup, and a wrinkled sweatshirt, so unlike the polished woman I'd known. She cried through most of the questioning, denying any involvement but failing to give solid answers about the timeline of events. When the cops pressed her about the affair, she crumbled. Yes, we were seeing each other, she reportedly admitted, tears streaming down her face. But it wasn't serious, and it has nothing to do with Andre's disappearance. That was her defense. Nothing serious. Like that somehow made it better. Dale's interview went even worse. From what I gathered, he tried to play it cool, acting like he barely knew me and downplaying the relationship with Willa. But when the police confronted him with the texts and photos, he cracked. He admitted to the affair, but of course, threw Willa under the bus. She was unhappy in her marriage, he told them. She came to me for advice, and things just escalated. Escalated. What a pathetic way to describe betraying your wife and destroying a marriage. The media was relentless. Reporters camped outside Willa's house and Dale's temporary apartment, shoving microphones in their faces every time they stepped outside. Social media exploded with theories, memes, and public outrage. People dug into their pasts, finding every misstep and magnifying it. Some old high school acquaintance of Willa's even posted on Facebook about how she'd been fake and manipulative since they were teenagers. But the best part, the part that made it all worth it, was seeing Willa and Dale turn on each other. According to a friend who'd heard from someone close to Willa, she was furious at Dale for throwing her under the bus. She told the police that Dale had been controlling and had pressured her into the affair, painting herself as the victim. Dale, in turn, told them that Willa was emotionally unstable and had been obsessed with him. Their stories didn't align, which only made them look guiltier. Meanwhile, I stayed quiet, keeping a low profile in my motel room. But the time away gave me space to think, to really reflect on everything that had happened. There were moments, late at night, when I questioned whether I'd gone too far. Was it enough to ruin their reputations? Did they deserve to have their lives destroyed like this? Then I'd remember the texts, the photos, the late nights Willa spent with Dale while I worked my ass off to build a life for us. I'd remember the lies, the excuses, the way she looked me in the eye and told me she loved me while sneaking off to be with someone else. No. They deserved every second of this. As the investigation heated up, the police started seizing phones and laptops, combing through everything for more evidence. Of course, they found nothing linking them to my disappearance, but the damage was done. Willa's employer placed her on unpaid leave, citing the ongoing investigation as a disruption to the workplace. Her savings were drying up, and she couldn't rely on her family. Her parents had taken a step back, ashamed of the media frenzy surrounding their daughter. Dale, meanwhile, lost whatever was left of his career. His wife filed for divorce and publicly accused him of emotionally abusing her. She even did a sit-down interview with a local reporter, where she talked about how Dale had manipulated her for years and how she wasn't surprised by the allegations. Watching it all from the sidelines, I couldn't help but smile. Everything was falling apart for them, just like they'd torn apart my life. But I knew I couldn't hide forever. The plan had worked, but the longer I stayed gone, the riskier it became. People were starting to speculate about whether I was alive at all, and the police were running out of leads. I needed to come back, but on my terms. I spent the next few days preparing. I cleaned out the storage unit, leaving nothing behind that could tie me to it. I burned the rest of the fake evidence, making sure no one would ever find out how carefully I'd orchestrated this. Then, I made the call. Willa and Dale were sinking deeper by the day, and the fallout was hitting them hard. Willa's polished, confident persona, the one she'd always been so proud of, was gone. Mutual acquaintances told me she barely left the house anymore. Her perfect makeup and flawless hair were replaced by dark circles under her eyes and a frazzled look that screamed exhaustion. Dale, on the other hand, was faring even worse. His wife had officially filed for divorce, and his company issued a statement saying they'd terminated his contract due to violations of company policy. I heard he was living out of a motel now, much like me, though under far less controlled circumstances. The best part? They were starting to turn on each other. It started with Dale's official statement, through his lawyer. He released a letter to the press denying any involvement in my disappearance, but he didn't stop there. He threw Willa under the bus, claiming she'd been the one to initiate the affair and that she'd been unstable and manipulative. He painted himself as the victim of her lies, saying he'd tried to end things, but she'd kept pulling him back in. When that hit the news, Willa lost it. The next day, she was cornered by a reporter outside the house. She snapped, yelling into the camera that Dale was a liar and that he'd been obsessed with her. "He wouldn't leave me alone," she shouted, tears streaming down her face. I tried to stop it, but he wouldn't take no for an answer. It was chaos, pure and simple. The media ate it up, playing clips of Willa's meltdown alongside Dale's smug-looking press photos. Social media erupted, with people picking sides, though most seemed to agree they were both awful. Meanwhile, I was watching from a safe distance, letting the storm rage on. My disappearance was still the center of the investigation, and every move Willa and Dale made only dug them deeper into the hole I'd created. The police weren't letting up either. They called Willa and Dale in for separate interrogations, and I heard through a contact in law enforcement that things got ugly. Dale cracked first, trying to pin everything on Willa. "She told me Andre knew about us," he said, according to the reports. She said he was furious, that he might try to do something crazy. When they pressed him for details, Dale panicked. "I wasn't there that night. I don't know what happened." Willa's turn came next, and if she was already on edge, the interrogation pushed her over it. She denied everything at first, sticking to her story that she had no idea what happened to me. But when they hit her with the evidence, the texts, the photos, the anonymous tips I'd sent, it was clear she was flailing. "I didn't hurt him," she reportedly cried. "You have to believe me. I loved him." The irony of that statement wasn't lost on me. Her attempt to play the grieving wife fell flat when the police pointed out the inconsistencies in her story. "If you loved him," they asked, "why didn't you report him missing right away? Why didn't you tell us about your relationship with Dale?" Willa had no good answers. The media took these interrogations and ran wild with speculation. Headlines like, "Did Willa's affair drive her husband over the edge?" and "Dale, the boss who couldn't keep his hands clean," were everywhere. The story was no longer about me, it was about them, about their lies and betrayal, about how they'd become the perfect villains in a real-life drama. But I wasn't satisfied yet. I had one final card to play. The weeks of chaos and destruction had reached their peak, and it was finally time for me to pull the curtain back. Watching Willa and Dale spiral was satisfying, yes, but this wasn't just about them losing their reputations or their jobs. This was about reclaiming my life, my peace, and my future. They had shattered everything I thought I knew, and now it was my turn to close the chapter, on my terms. I started with one final message. From a quiet library in a small town far from home, I logged onto an anonymous email account I'd created weeks ago. I sent a short but deliberate email to the lead detective on my case. Subject line: "You're looking in the wrong place." The email read, "I'm alive. You'll find me when I'm ready to be found. But look closer at Willa and Dale. They've lied to you about everything. The affair is just the tip of the iceberg. Follow the money." It was vague enough to keep them guessing but specific enough to redirect attention back to Willa and Dale, ensuring the heat on them wouldn't die down anytime soon. Then I called Greg, my closest friend, the one person I trusted to help me without question. "Greg," I said, my voice low but steady, "I need your help." I told him everything, well, almost everything. I left out the finer details of how I'd staged the disappearance, but I explained the betrayal, the affair, and the lies. Greg was furious. He'd always been suspicious of Willa, but hearing it confirmed sent him into a rage. "She deserves everything coming to her," he said. I asked him to meet me in a city a few hours away. "I need a ride back," I told him. "It's time to go home." Greg picked me up the next morning, and as we drove, I laid out the rest of my plan. I wasn't going to walk back into town quietly. No, my return needed to make a statement. The moment we arrived back in my hometown, I had Greg drop me off at the police station. I walked through those doors like a man returning from war, unshaven, wearing old clothes, and carrying a duffel bag filled with evidence I'd prepared to cover my tracks. The officer at the front desk froze when he saw me. "Andre," he asked, wide-eyed. "That's me," I said calmly. "I think you've been looking for me." Within minutes, I was surrounded by detectives, all bombarding me with questions. Where had I been? What happened to me? Why hadn't I come forward sooner? I kept my story simple. I told them I'd left town after discovering Willa's affair, feeling overwhelmed and unsure of what to do. I painted myself as a man pushed to the brink, needing time to think, to process everything. I didn't want to cause trouble, I said, letting my voice crack just enough. I just needed to get away. The cops were skeptical, of course, but I had answers for everything. I told them about Willa and Dale's affair, about the texts and emails I'd found, and how I felt like I couldn't stay in the same house as her anymore. Then I pulled out my trump card, a flash drive filled with the photos, texts, and other evidence the private investigator had gathered, plus a few extra messages I'd fabricated to paint Willa and Dale in an even worse light. The detectives ate it up. By the time I finished, they were looking at Willa and Dale not just as liars, but as people who might have had every reason to make me disappear permanently. They let me go that night, though they made it clear there'd be more questions to answer. That was fine by me. I had bigger plans for the next day. The morning after my homecoming, I held a press conference outside the police station. Greg helped me organize it, calling in every local reporter he could find. By the time I stepped up to the microphone, a small crowd had gathered, cameras flashing and microphones pointed my way. I stood there, looking like the picture of a man who had been through hell. "I want to thank everyone who's been searching for me," I began, my voice steady but heavy. "These past few weeks have been the most challenging of my life. I left because I felt like I had no other choice. I was betrayed by the person I trusted most, my wife, and her actions left me broken." I paused, letting the weight of my words sink in. Willa and Dale thought they could get away with their lies, their betrayal, but the truth has a way of coming out. I've told the police everything I know, and I trust them to take the necessary steps to uncover the full story. The crowd erupted into questions, but I didn't stick around to answer them. I'd said everything I needed to. The aftermath was everything I'd hoped for. Willa became a pariah, both in our community and beyond. Her face was all over the news, not as a grieving wife but as the woman who drove her husband to the edge. People turned on her, accusing her of manipulation and deceit. Even her closest friends distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with her scandal. Dale, meanwhile, was hit even harder. The new evidence I'd given the police prompted a full financial investigation into his dealings at work. It turned out he'd been embezzling money for years, and when that came to light, any shred of his reputation that remained was obliterated. The last I heard, Willa had moved in with her parents, who were reportedly ashamed of her, and Dale was facing multiple lawsuits and the possibility of jail time. And me? I filed for divorce the day after the press conference, and it was finalized within months. Willa tried to contact me once or twice, leaving tearful voicemails and writing long emails about how sorry she was, but I never responded. Instead, I focused on rebuilding my life. I doubled down on my business, expanding it even further, and used the experience as fuel to push myself harder than ever. I didn't just survive, I thrived. Willa and Dale may have thought they could betray me and walk away unscathed, but they underestimated one thing, me. In the end, I didn't just take my life back, I built something better.